Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Syrian analyst Ehsani returns to the show to talk about the latest developments in the Syrian war, with a focus on the Idlib deal, on Turkey's role in the war, some perspectives from Syrians, and the prospects for recovery. Ehsani is a Syrian American originally from Aleppo. You can find his social media analysis and discussion about Syria on Twitter at Ehsani22. He has also written for the Syria comment blog under the pseudonym Ehsani. This was recorded on October 2nd, 2018. Greetings, Ehsani. I'm so glad to have you back on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So for our listeners, you'll see in the show notes that I've linked to two previous interviews with Ehsani on this show. One of them is episode 34. It was about a year ago on September 20th, 2017, called An End to the Syrian War. And then episode 45, March 27th of this year, titled Ghouta, Afrin, and Eastern Syria. So, Ehsani, about a year ago, we talked about the end of the Syrian war, and you were right. It was winding down at that point, and we're even closer to an end to that war right now, we hope, so to speak. And nobody really thought it was going to happen quickly. So your analysis back then held up pretty well, I would say. Let me lay out some of the topics that I hope we can touch on in this discussion. I realize it's a lot. We might not get to all of them. But when we were planning this interview earlier, I said to Ehsani that it'd be great if he could give us his thoughts on the Idlib deal, the various fighter groups in and around Idlib, because it's hard to sort those out, and also on Erdogan, Turkey, and what the heck that guy's doing. Importantly, I'm always interested in hearing, whatever perspective you can offer from the people in Syria who you keep in touch with, because, it's always great to hear. And then if we have any time left, your outlook on how Syria is going to recover from this disaster of a war. Now, of course, we're going to let the conversation go wherever it goes, but I hope we can get to all or most of that. So should we start with Idlib?
Sure. So, as you know, Idlib the deal was culminated between the presidents of Turkey and Russia in Sochi. It was called the Sochi Agreement or the Idlib Agreement. When the announcement was made, there was little details offered at the time. It's been now almost 10 days since then. We have gotten a little bit more details, but not enough. And let's just recap what we do know. What we do know is that by October 15th, we have a buffer zone of about 20 kilometers, and that buffer zone will be free of heavy weapons and quote-unquote terrorists. Since then, a lot of people first really liked the deal because it stopped a military operation, and everyone was worried about the civilians that live in the province. And since the deal was announced, and after a few days now of people absorbing what it is, what the details are, and what the document actually entails, there's been a little bit of a revision, of attitudes, because one of the main groups that are part of the so-called moderate groups, Jaish al-Azza more specifically, was first to come out and say, we don't really abide by this deal. And the reason is primarily that the 15 or 20 kilometers that are being talked about really are all on our side. And they said that we were under the impression that it was also the regime that was going to be losing some territory, and therefore that 20 kilometers is almost like half type of deal. Of course, that was not the idea that most of us thought when we read the document, because the highway, the M4 and M5 highways, run pretty close to that buffer zone. At any rate, right now, just as I expected at the time, and many others have expected, while everybody was happy to see the deal when it was announced, some of us knew that delivering on the details was going to be a lot harder than the initial euphoria that came with the deal's announcement. And indeed, as October 15th approaches, we don't really have much, at least publicly. Now, one hopes that privately the Turkish authorities are doing a lot of work behind the scenes and convincing these groups to abide by the deal that they have pledged and signed with the Russian side. Now, of course, as I said, the deal lacks a lot of the specific details that we would like to know. So most of us ought to probably take a breath and take a breather and really wait for that October 15th date to come and see what it is that Turkey will deliver by that time. I was skeptical then. I remain skeptical today that they will deliver what many of us thought the agreement essentially covered. Now, the reaction also when October 15th comes and goes, it'll be interesting to see what the Russian reaction is. Is it going to be, okay, we understand some of the challenges that Ankara is facing, and we're going to extend this another 3 months? Or are they going to say, you know what, enough is enough. We have given you the time. You've committed to a deal. And I've in the past few days, I have come to describe this particular transaction or relationship as an engagement between the two presidents, that is of Turkey and Russia. And as time goes by, we shall see if this engagement leads, I've been using these terms, whether it leads into a divorce or it leads into a full marriage. and that is what we will be watching. And obviously it will very much depend on how Putin would want to carry on with this relationship. Is he about to pull the plug on this and say, you know, that's it, we have extended this as far as we can, we've given you the chance, and this hasn't worked. So everyone wants to avoid, obviously, a confrontation, a military confrontation. Everybody wants this, including Damascus, of course, partly because the operation is not easy. Yes, they have the assets in place. Yes, they can carry out the military operation, but guerrilla warfare post the operation will be a real risk, and holding a place like Idlib after an army goes in is not going to be an easy feat. That is a fact. It's a military fact, and therefore the Syrian government and the Russians would like actually for this deal to work, and would like for Turkey to deliver. And that is, at a minimum, get first the heavy weapons out, the terrorist groups out, and then they go to the next phase, which effectively had meant that the Syrian government institutions go closer into the area and start to reach out and do some of the reconciliation deals that had been taking place in earlier areas. This is all very theoretical right now, and I'm not sure if anyone really knows how it's going to play out. In fact, I know that very few people really have any visibility on this. So as I said, the next 2 weeks will be October 15th is one deadline, but you know, it could come and go, and people could just extend it, and for technical and other reasons. You know, by and large, obviously the big picture, if you step back from this, you know, a lot of people believe that, look, this Idlib province is Turkey's now. There is no conceivable way in which the Syrian state will take it back. and regardless of how this deal works out. And I would caution against this because I think that the Syrian government is extremely reluctant to make this a precedent of any sort, because it would mean that any area that goes through the experience of Idlib, and 2 years from now, 3 years from now, if there's a particular province or city or neighborhood or region in the country that does the same thing through whether it's Turkey or Jordan, the Syrian government cannot let this thing be an example to follow. And therefore, and given the history, as you know, of Turkey and Syria, land that had been taken and not given back to to Syria, to the modern Syrian state as we know it today. I'm talking about Hatay, Iskenderun. There's a lot of history as well. So it is the Turkish involvement in Syria and having Idlib and Afrin and other parts of Syria under Turkish so-called, I don't want to call it rule or call it takeover, really. I mean, the army is in those areas. They're administering them. They're putting flags. They're teaching their language. For the government of Syria, this is very, very deep stuff. I mean, it's not something that they can take lightly, and they're not. They absolutely are not. And so what we're going through now is this engagement phase where it's better to just sit back, give diplomacy a chance, give the Turks a chance to figure out a way to solve this peacefully and diplomatically. Now, at the end of all of this, it would mean that even the peaceful / diplomatic way of solving this and avoiding a civilian disaster, it would mean ultimately that Turkey will hand this area back to Syrian government. So this is not, when I say the word peaceful and diplomatic, we're not talking here about Syria giving up this territory or somehow finding out a working relationship where the Turks administer it or run the affairs. I mean, this is not something that is in the toolbox right now as far as Damascus is concerned. So,
has Turkey agreed to give it back?
No, but Turkey has never said we have taken it. I mean, they can't and they won't say that. Right. Because the idea, what you hear Turkish officials say, is that we're doing this to save. These are people who ran away from a brutal regime. They've escaped death, and they've come over to this province. And our being here and our taking care of this province has avoided, the massacre of 3 million people. And that's the way it is sold. And it has never given a date, or it has not given an end game here. From their perspective, they've kept this open-ended, and you just let time take care of itself. And of course, as you can see, what they're doing is when you see these rallies now on Fridays, you see a lot of Turkish flags, crisp, new, flags being handed to the Syrian population, and they go out after mosques or during a Friday morning, they hold Syrian opposition flags and Turkish flags next to each other, and effectively this is sending signals to the international community and so on that we are loved, we're liked. The Syrian opposition wants us here, and indeed they do. I'm sure they do because the alternative is obviously a lot worse for a lot of the Syrians who have decided to take this path, and rather than reconcile with the Syrian government, and this is an important point to actually touch on now, to recap how we got here, how the Syrians that ended up at the province made this journey was through rejecting the reconciliation deals, the various reconciliation deals with the Syrian government. That's from Ghouta to eastern Aleppo to Dara, and effectively choosing some switch side and walk to the other side. But some said, no, I absolutely don't want to do this, and I want to go to Idlib. And in order for these deals to conclude, the Syrian government agreed to that and said, okay, you want to go to Idlib, the Russians, the UN, everybody was happy to just essentially kick the can down the road. What we're seeing now is that we are at that fork, and these decisions have to be made sooner or later. So that's where we are.
How about in like Jarablus and maybe even Manbij? Yeah. I've seen buildings where the schools and the different administrative buildings, they're all flying the Turkish flag, and on the walls they have pictures of Erdogan and the Turkish flag. Is it still like, I assume it's still like that there?
Very, very much like that. And I think that for the Turks, they would look at Idlib and Jarablus and so on are a little bit differently, because the examples you've cited on Jarablus and other areas to the east are really Kurdish areas. And there is absolutely no doubt that the Turkish government would love to see every Kurd gone from those areas. I mean, so the investment they have made there and they will continue to make is far exceeds their attachment to a place like Idlib, because for them, the Kurdish file is the main strategic national security risk for Ankara, and therefore they can turn around and say these are terrorists, and so they could just sell this to the international community and say, for example, that these are all terrorists, and we owe our public to come in here and to create a zone free of these people who wish us no good, and under fighting terrorism, they have invested and stayed in these areas as you correctly pointed out. Of course, this excuse is a little bit less intense when it comes to Idlib. It's a different style of argument. What they're saying there is that they're doing it on humanitarian grounds rather than anti-terrorism crowd or counter-terrorism grounds. And they're saying that we're here on the humanitarian grounds of saving the Syrian people who have opted to hide and run away from their leader who's after them and wants to kill them. And so it's a slightly different nuance and than the way they're using the arguments in places like Afrin and Jarablus.
I think I also heard them say that they're creating areas where the Syrian refugees currently in Turkey can go back to safely.
Sure. So on that score, of course, you are now hearing a lot more anger in Turkish cities about seeing Syrian refugees who have taken jobs from them. You are seeing a lot more pressure on Erdogan from his own population about the 3 million or so Syrians who have decided to live and reside in Turkey. And I think the Turkish government wouldn't mind at all to remove the Kurdish population, the Syrian Kurdish population from northern Syria, and have a lot of the refugees within the current Turkish borders or in Idlib move there. I mean, this is absolutely the grand plan, if you wish. It's not really grand. It's a very obvious plan that they have been conducting, and they will continue to do so.
That's interesting. Now, it's not just Idlib province that it hasn't been yet taken back by the government, right? Aren't there still some rural areas around Homs and yes, also up further in Aleppo?
Yes, essentially Western Aleppo that is connected to Idlib, geographically very simple line that you can draw to connect it to. The rebels are still there, indeed. They're also in the rural parts of Hama. And again, this is all one extension of their Idlib operation presence.
I see. So it's like continuous. They're just not they're not perfectly inside the borders of Idlib.
Correct. I mean, the western part of Aleppo, the rural western part of Aleppo, essentially connects into the Idlib province. And you're talking about, I mean, when you say the rural parts of Aleppo, I think listeners need to really understand that we're talking about 10 minutes drive from downtown Aleppo. We're not talking rural, meaning you have to drive an hour or even really 35 or 30 minutes. I mean, you maximum 15 minutes, and I know these areas very well. It's a 15-minute drive. And
yeah, it is important to say that, because with Americans, we're thinking that other countries are on the same scale as ours. We have to remember these are small countries relatively.
I mean, it really just happens the geography of it and the way Idlib connects to it. The Syrian government hasn't yet, the army hasn't yet gone over and north and northwest of Aleppo city proper, because they know that particular military operation is connected to the Idlib operation. I mean, you can't kind of separate. It'll be a real challenge to go into this Aleppo area. So there is a standstill right now, but on a daily basis, by the way, I mean, literally on a daily basis, you have mortars being shelled from the rebels, which are in these areas, into the city, even today.
Still?
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. Almost daily. And the way the government deals with it, it shells them back. It sends mortars their way. And after about 30 minutes, they just go quiet. And they start the next day. So this has been going on now since December 16th.
So if you live in Aleppo and you want to go to Damascus,
yes,
normally there'd be a main road like let's call it like I-95.
Yes, like the I-95. It's called the M5, and that is a highway that was built in the early 70s, and that highway connects Aleppo to Damascus by going through Hama and Homs. But the very first about 40 minutes on your drive as you head out from Aleppo, you will essentially enter Idlib province. And so this highway right now is not operating. You can't even drive 15 minutes out of the city on that highway before it is already in rebels' hands. And so
do you still drive through it, or do you avoid it?
No, you can't. I mean, if you're a government area, this is complete. I mean, it's essentially Bab el-Hawa crossing, which is the famous Turkish-Syrian border crossing. That is about 15 minutes out from Aleppo city, and that is already in not in government.
So the big checkpoint and everything.
Yeah. So really, for all practical purposes, that road is completely blocked. And so what residents of almost used to be 4 million, now it's 2.5 million people, they travel on this incredibly. I've spoken about this many times. I made the journey back in November, and I said I will never go back to this city unless either the airport is open or the highway is back.
Just a lot of traffic and bad roads, and
extremely dangerous. There's a lot of traffic, a lot of checkpoints. It's not really built as a road to handle the traffic that goes through, and so it really is not a very pleasant situation at all, and it has affected commerce. So the highway is a very important part of this Idlib deal. That's why it was explicitly mentioned in the Idlib deal, and it's the reason why the Syrian government, accepted the deal as it was, and the Russians made sure, because it would give economic vitality back to these cities, and particularly Aleppo, and have the government areas connected in a more seamless way. But again, we will see if this deal ends up actually having this highways open the way we thought they would be.
So mainly, they see Idlib as a long-term project, but they need that road back.
Yes, you're talking they, meaning the Syrian government.
The government, yeah.
Well, I don't know about long-term project. I think let's be specific. I mean, I believe by October 15th is our first deadline. And if October 15th comes and goes without delivering on the what was in that agreement, I believe the onus is on Putin to really answer and say why the deal wasn't abided by. Why was this date? Why did the Turks not do what they were supposed to do by that date? And I am not sure what his response will be. He's the signatory to that deal, and he will have to answer why the Turkish government wasn't able to deliver.
And he's supposed to get all the foreign fighters out and all of the jihadis out.
Yeah.
True?
So this is obviously, look, not a single person has an answer to this problem. And I mean, no one. Putin, Erdogan, Assad, US government, European Union, no one knows what to do with these people. First of all, no one knows the actual numbers. 10,000 has been mentioned often. Is that the number? Frankly, no one knows. Is the number 30,000? Is the number 10,000? And with their families, does the number go up to 60? And what do we do with them? Where are they going to go? Which country is going to take them? These are all completely, that's why I was skeptical of the deal. The deal, when it was announced, everybody was rejoicing that this was great. We avoided this. Yes, okay, we kicked the can down the road for about a month, but then what? And I think we're coming to that pretty soon, in 13 days from now.
Well, for me, it's always really hard to sort these groups out. And, just so that when I hear a name, I know who we're talking about. And, I was really prone to just figuring out who the Al-Qaeda affiliated groups were, who the ISIS groups were, and everyone else sort of fit into the rebel category. But I was talking to Elijah recently, and he was telling me that Al-Qaeda really, that first of all, al-Nusra, and then now they're, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, that the people under Gilani, that they hold Idlib city, and they're no longer considered to be in the terrorist group. They've come under Turkey's umbrella, and so they're going to reconcile, I guess, in some way. And that the only group that's considered to be Al-Qaeda now is a new one for me, Haras ad-Din, right? Mm-hmm. A whole different guy. So that's Al-Qaeda now. And then you have Ahrar al-Sham, who they're still on the enemies list, right?
Well, no. Ahrar al-Sham is not considered a terrorist organization.
Okay, they're not. All right. So if you can get a lot of these guys to come under Turkey's umbrella of legitimate rebels, then you don't have to relocate as many people, right?
Yes. And again, this is why I thought this deal will not work, because a lot of this stuff was very, there was a lot of gray areas. The terminology used Al-Qaeda affiliated groups one time, and then they used terrorists the other time. And who are the terrorists and who aren't? And is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham really a terrorist, as Elijah was saying? Now it's Haras ad-Din. Look, I mean, all these not games, but this is a really, really difficult issue. I mean, as you know, for the Syrian government, obviously, they really have spent not as much time or energy into this subject because they considered all these groups equally. They're all insurgents who took up arms against the state, and it matters very little to the Syrian government whether you are Ahrar or whether you are Hayat al-Tahrir or you are Zenki or you are even Jaish al-Azza, which is supposed to be FSA. I mean, it absolutely matters very, very little to Damascus which group you are. Now, for others, they aren't going to get into these technicalities. Of course, for the United States and for all nations that support the opposition, they do believe there is a legitimate opposition. So obviously, this is the Damascus narrative. But there is another narrative which says, look, these are real Syrians. They're nationalists. They took up arms. They're moderate, and you can't just tell them that you are terrorists. And this is where the Syrian government and those nations who have embraced the opposition have really come at odds over the last 7 years, or
right.
Who are these groups? But
over and over again. I mean,
over and over, and this will continue. By the way, I mean, like this is why this deal is going to get. Once you get into the nitty-gritty detail, it's going to be a pretty difficult one to nail down.
But it sounds like Damascus, if they accepted the Idlib deal, now, like you said, the devil's in the details, potentially, or almost definitely. But it sounds like they've relented a little bit on their definition of who's a terrorist and who's not.
No, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that because ultimately the Damascus government wants the province back. So every province and every area in Syria that was taken back, it was taken back without anyone carrying arms. You hand your arms, you reconcile with the Syrian state, and that area is, you move on to the next area. So if it works out similarly to every other area, it will be exactly the same. At the end of the day, yes, the Syrian state will consider Ahrar al-Sham exactly the same as it would look at Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or even Huras al-Din for that matter. The area that will come back under Syrian government control will have no armed men in it as such.
Well, I don't know. I can't help but think that the reason this kind of a deal would be cut is either they're kicking the can down the road again and they just want to get that road open and they want to, normalize some more territory, or that Putin intends to agree to Turkey taking that part of the country because Turkey doesn't see them as terrorists. They'd be fine with them staying there and living there and among.
I'm really glad you raised this point and as a question. I do not believe that Putin will agree with Turkey taking Idlib and keeping the moderate rebels, so-called moderate rebels, in there. This is not the plan. The coordination between Putin and President Assad is extremely strong. Both capitals are coordinating this. There is no Putin plan and Assad plan, and therefore both sides to this are on the same wavelength here. That they see this as an area or a province that the Syrian state will have to reestablish control over. Period. There is no deal as such. And again, I go back to my analogy of the engagement phase. Putin is viewing this as, look, instead of having the military operation, the world is saying, the world is watching. President Trump is tweeting about this. 3 million people were going to die. And what President Putin and Assad have done is that they said, okay, let's prove that we are actually going after a diplomatic solution. And if Turkey agrees to abide by A, B, C, D, then we don't have to do this. But what that final phase is again that this province comes back under Syrian government umbrella state. And so that's really, and so I think the next 2 weeks to the end of the year, we are going to see how Moscow deals with this and how Putin approaches the October 15th deadline. And does he go faster into this divorce mode, or does he continue to invest in this marriage or this engagement rather? And we will see. I think that geopolitically, I personally, on my personal opinion, is that he will continue to play engagement phase with Erdogan. I don't think that he's ready to divorce yet and to start a military operation this quickly because he has all sorts of designs. NATO, he's splitting NATO apart. He's trying to deliver the S-400 to Turkey, which means that they cannot take deliveries of the F-35 planes from NATO. So there's a much, much larger game plan that is taking place in Putin's head. And one cannot look at the Idlib deal without paying attention to these issues as well. They are extremely, extremely interrelated. And Putin is not going to make a hasty decision on Idlib to lose out the significant amount of time and energy and effort that he has put in prizing Turkey slowly away from NATO, And there are reports that the delivery of the S-400, should it actually occur, will really dent NATO's plan in the southern hemisphere of NATO, and it would effectively mean that deliveries of the F-35 cannot take place. And so this is something that I think Erdogan knows, obviously, and he knows why Putin is giving him this leash, and he's giving him this extra time, and because he knows that Putin has his own designs and games that he's playing with Erdogan himself. And so I think Assad, from his perspective, he obviously knows this too, and he's sitting back and letting these games play themselves out. But as you know, the Syrian government is very, very patient. It plays the game in the long haul, and they will just sit back and let these things play out.
Right. I forgot about the detail about the F-35. So Turkey, the reason I chuckled earlier was because I thought you were going to joke about how Putin's, he has a lot on his plate. He's, I think he's taken over the world or something, isn't he?
I think the way many Russians obviously view it is that it's the other way around. Is the world is encroaching on them, and NATO is getting closer and has designs on all their surrounding neighborhood.
And, of course, I agree with that.
This is obviously their perspective. This is the way they view this matter. And Syria clearly was one of the ways in which Putin now has gained tremendous amount of leverage. He's at the table. He has been able to get into Turkey's head. No one ever thought that the S-400 could one day be delivered, to Turkey, NATO member, and now it's a real possibility, and so on and so forth. So I think Putin is clearly has his own games, and he's a very clever geostrategist, I'm sure, and Idlib is, in my personal opinion, is part of this jigsaw puzzle. Right.
And I mean, as it turns out, it's also election season.
Indeed.
And, he might be just waiting for a time when Americans are distracted or less likely to make any controversial moves. I mean, that could be part of it too.
Yes, but I think that the American, if you'd like to touch on the American presence in Syria and what's driving it, obviously the public here has very little support for any direct military intervention in Syria.
That's right.
The president himself doesn't really, just like the previous President Obama, both presidents don't really have the inclination to get involved militarily in this country. That is quite obvious. Now, the generals, when he was going to implement that policy, i.e., leave Syria, the generals were against that. They sat him down and explained that, look, we need to remain for two reasons. The first reason is we need to have leverage in this game. If we leave, then we lost and we let Assad win, and that is unacceptable, and that is a weak America that you were blaming President Obama to be part of, but you cannot appear weak. And that's one. The second reason is obviously this whole Iranian thing. I mean, Israel is absolutely paranoid that Iran is taking over Syria and making it the next Lebanon, and it will stage Hezbollah type activities in Syria. And the reason it is able to do that is because President Assad is too weak. He cannot say no, and he will have to yield to any request that the Iranians make in terms of having presence in the country. A lot of people have put up heat maps. They've put up articles and arguments that bases are being built. The Israelis have pointed out to missile factories and to military bases and to even ports that are being built on the Mediterranean. I have spoken about this issue. I believe all that has been written on this is incorrect. It is not borne out by the facts. The facts continue to be that Iran's presence in Syria peaked in December 2016 after the Aleppo operations. It has been on steady decline, and that is just logical. The need for paramilitary groups to fight in places like Aleppo and Ghouta and Dara is no longer there. And what the strategy needed in Idlib is not going to require Iranian militias there. If it does, and if there are few available, obviously this is not the kind of extent that people are writing about. And the idea that President Assad will actually agree to this is ludicrous because, we know how seriously they take sovereignty. We know how seriously what is it in for President Assad to now at this stage take on the Israeli army? I mean, we know that Syria can never fight the Israelis today. There's just no military balance here whatsoever. And this is not a fight that Damascus is ever going to get into at this stage. Damascus is fighting a different fight. It's fighting against the rebels. It wants its country back. It wants to kick the terrorists out. And the last thing that Damascus wants to do is take on Israel. I mean, that is absolutely not a sane military strategy. And therefore, the idea that Assad would allow Iran to come in and take bases and give the pretense to Israel to come and attack him and the Syrian government is totally ludicrous. And so I believe that, however, we do know that the current Israeli government and the U.S. administration are extremely close. This is one of the closest relationships we have witnessed for a long, long time. And therefore, Israel has essentially asked and requested and explicitly warned against an early U.S. pullout because the U.S. needs to stay there to stop Iranian expansion in Syria. And indeed, a couple of days ago, the new envoy to Syria has said that we want a stable Syria without the influence of the Iranian regime. This is the new terminology that has been put up by the State Department. And this terminology effectively has widened the scope of American presence in Syria.
Serious mission creep.
Yes,
serious
mission creep. Absolutely, it's mission creep. And let's kind of also talk about what is this mission. It is actually, in the scheme of things, it's a relatively cheap, small mission, and this is why the president himself didn't resist. What they have sat him down and explained is that we have 2,200 soldiers. They have just said they want to send more advisors. So again, you can argue more mission creep, but it's not a very expensive operation in the scheme of American military operations overseas. They don't have an insurgency that is killing U.S. soldiers against them like they did in Iraq, and so the pressure to leave is not really there. And I think what the president finally concluded is that if I can push all the criticism of me that I cut and run and allowed Iran to take over Syria by staying in this relatively limited fashion, I can deflect all this criticism. I can appear to be tough. I can appear to be anti-Assad. I can appear to be pushing back against Russian takeover of Syria and the Middle East. And therefore, I am going to stay. And I think the current status quo that you're seeing is going to be with us for a number of years, in my opinion. I mean, I cannot imagine a scenario where the U.S. government is suddenly going to say, okay, there are no more Iranians now that they've put this new mission creep, as you refer to it. They are never going to say, oh, Syria has absolutely no Iranian influence left, and it is stable now, which is the second prerequisite, and therefore we're leaving. Because this brings us to the last point on the Kurds. The reason the Kurds haven't struck a deal with the Syrian government is because they know that the U.S. is going to stay. They've made the calculation that for the reasons I've cited, the U.S. is unlikely to leave anytime soon. And if it is unlikely to leave anytime soon, why should we go and get the first deal that Damascus offers us? We can get a better deal. We are now in control of the oil fields, the Omar oil fields, the largest oil fields in the country. We are in control of it thanks to the U.S. backing. And this is the leverage that we can always hold in negotiations with the Syrian government. And this has meant that the talks between Damascus and the Kurds have taken a backseat. They're really on the back burner. I don't think they're talking, they're discussing continuously, but I do not believe that there is any imminent deal in the offing here. And it's partly because there is no incentive to make a deal from the Kurdish side.
And that's interesting because just a few months ago, I had read that, the Syrian Kurds were more serious about talking to the government in Damascus because they anticipated Americans leaving, and they just really didn't have any long-term trust that we were going to, hold that territory for them until they were able to hold it themselves, I guess. But on the other hand, another interesting thing is that I hear a lot of people saying, when they talk about Syria, they say, well, the government has almost recovered all the territory. They've almost gotten all their land back. And I'm like, what about the East? What about everything east of the Euphrates? Are we just going to forget about that? Or are we just going to, I don't understand what's going on. If they just accepted that that's gone or what?
No. Again, of course, with the American presence, the way the Syrian government views that is that, okay, they will stay for 4 years, 5 years, maybe longer, but they ultimately will leave. And we're here. They're sending their soldiers over here, and we can just sit it out. And the game plan in Damascus is that no matter how long this takes, ultimately, the Kurds will be forced to come to the talks. Maybe force is not the right word. Kurds will calculate one day that it is in their longer-term advantage to strike a deal with the Syrian government, because the Syrian government is going nowhere. And yes, the Americans are there now, but they may not be, as you said. And finally, I think the hope of the Syrian government has always been that the Kurds know that their primary enemy is the same primary enemy that the Syrian government has, which is the Turkish government and Erdogan, particularly, specifically. So they both, I think, know that this is their number one national security risk for both, and for the Kurdish leadership as well as the Syrian leadership. They know that Erdogan is their joint enemy, and therefore Damascus has been under the impression that the day will come that the Kurds will see it this way. And as I said, the American presence is just delaying what the Syrian government sees as a natural process that will eventually culminate in a deal.
Yeah, I guess we'll see. But what can also happen is that the longer people are settled in an area, the more likely that they'll, keep that area. But I guess this is different. They don't plan on going anywhere. It's just a matter of what the technical, what the official definition of the country is going to be, what the new constitution will be like, and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not belittling the point that this is hard work. I'm not saying that the deal is going to be done anytime soon. I think we're still talking probably in years before this thing is solved. And so this crisis is not exactly over, but it's kind of becoming a little bit more contained I mean, we just found out that September was the least number of casualties month we have seen in years.
That's fantastic.
And so because I think the crisis now has taken a different direction, it is now to do, Idlib, obviously there is a ceasefire, obviously, because the deal is about to be struck, and therefore the life is slowly returning. But that brings me to your final point on what happens in the years from now issue. And how, if one fast forward, none of us can predict the future, obviously.
Right.
But if someone can chart out how this thing is likely to proceed, I think it's going to be really difficult for Syrians, obviously, because the country is likely to stay under sanctions for a long, long time. Why do I say that? The technicality of the sanctions are such that the president needs congressional approval to lift those sanctions. Assad will have to do a huge, huge amount of concessions that he obviously is not going to do, because the concessions will, if you read them, they want him to, right now, the only political process that is continuing in Syria is the constitution issue that you referred to. And the US has been asking that this constitution, through de Mistura, the envoy at the UN, be concluded and leads to elections, presidential elections. Of course, the hope here is that the constitution will be written in a way that opens the door rather widely for the removal of Assad, because presumably he will go into this election and conceivably lose it. Of course, the Syrian government is going to write a constitution that makes it harder for that outcome to take place, and hence this whole constitution thing is bogged down, in UN corridors, where Staffan de Mistura is really the only thing he's working on, as far as I know, politically at least, is this. So, look, constitutional changes and so on, sovereignty will come into this. The government will not allow other people to sit and write a constitution for it. This is not the way it works from their perspective, and so they're going to delay this process and bog it down, and essentially only produce a document that they also would be in agreement with. I cannot fathom a situation where it is thrown at the desk of President Assad and said, here's the constitution, we've worked on it, everyone of the foreign powers agreed, and you have to agree, and this is the new constitution. This is not the way it's going to work. And so I remain skeptical that the US plan, at least the way I hear it today, to do this via writing constitution, having an election, and having Assad essentially lose in that election, presumably, I find that rather unlikely to happen. In the way, at least, it is being said or talked about. So what happens? The country remains under sanctions. The idea that the Syrian leadership is going to hit, as a result, the panic mode and say, oh my God, we're going to remain under sanctions for the next 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. It's time for us to hand the keys and leave, or it's time for... It is really quite silly. I mean, this is a government that has gone into a life and death situation. Thousands, hundreds of thousands have died as a result of this war. To suggest that rebuilding the country or not having foreign funding is now going to cause the state to walk away is fiction, honestly.
Right, and not to mention, Ehsani, that things that happen with the global economy may make sanctions from the United States and Western countries less important. It looks to me like, some countries are developing alternative ways to do trade, non-dollar trade. So that could change the picture too.
No, I think. Look, let's be specifically here. The U.S. owns the SWIFT system. It means no banking transaction can take place, no credit cards. I was in Damascus in November. You cannot use anything. I mean, you are literally, it is a cash economy. No one can accept your deposits in any bank as a Syrian citizen. You can't open dollar accounts anywhere, not even in Lebanon or Turkey or really anywhere. And so even when foreign companies come to operate, how are they going to make payments and how are they going to transfer? And it is a very, very difficult situation. Let's not.
Yeah, it's not going to happen in the short term. But
I mean, these sanctions by the Treasury departments that are, they are very effective. Now they're cruel, and they're cruel because the one entity that will not be affected is the regime itself. Indeed, a lot of these sanctions give warlords and people connected into the regime more avenues to make money because they're the only ones who have the routes, whether they're smuggling routes, whether they have the ability to use tremendously large capital transactions to make those deals. Whether they
that's bad.
I mean, the irony of it is that the sanctions make you feel good, they're effective, but they have hardly ever caused the regime to collapse and say, okay, I can't take the pain anymore. This is not the way these societies work and these political governments work.
Yeah, when the Iran deal was done, I can remember Rouhani sort of begging different organizations that have grown around, because of sanctions, like you said, these black markets and these different warlords and what, I don't know what you call them, smuggling lords. That's their business now. And how are you going to get them to, and the longer they stay in place, the more entrenched they are. And
you develop a war, what people call a war economy, and war economy has got new bunch of people who are benefiting from the system. And this is precisely what's going on in Syria. I mean, ultimately, these people will charge way more, and the final consumer products are 30, 40, 50% more expensive they would have been without the sanctions. Now, they do come in because ultimately people will always find a way to get stuff in, as you say, but at an exuberant cost that ultimately will be paid by the average Syrian citizen, which no one at the end of the day really cares about. I mean, they say they care about, but if you look at the actions and the way the policies are designed, they know that they are going to end up hurting the average citizen way more they would be hurting, a senior person in the regime.
So what are the kinds of things you're hearing from, your friends and family in there? What are they thinking? I don't know. Anything interesting you're hearing?
So things are getting better. I think, obviously life is relative. And in the case of Syrians who remain in Syria, it is really, really quite relative. So compared, if you're a average citizen of Aleppo, comparing today to pre-2016 is like living in Switzerland.
Yeah,
it's amazing, right? It's great, but the truth is that it's not. I mean, it's not because the government doesn't have the means to invest in infrastructure. The electric capacity is still not back. The sanctions make it very, very hard to do this. So look, this is going to be in a relative sense, you can compare your life today to yesterday and say, yes, it's getting better. But is it really something that in an absolute sense, is it where it can be or should be, or absolutely not?
What about the young people? Is there going to be it seems likely there'll be a brain drain. They're going to leave for, more opportunities.
Well, the brain drain has been enormous, but particularly because of the military service.
Oh, yeah.
I did notice it when I was back in Syria in the fall of last year, and you do notice many, many more women in social settings, whether they're restaurants or coffee shops. Men between the ages of 18 and 51 are subject to be called into the army.
51?
Yeah, up to 51, part of the reserves, because there's a reserve call-up.
Yeah.
So if you're age 49 or up to 51 and you're stopped by, you're stopped by a checkpoint and your name comes up that you've been recalled for service, they will arrest you and essentially have you join the army. And it was so dangerous because when the war was in full gear, a lot of these guys knew they were going and probably dying and never coming back. And so men, in fact, it's a really, really important point that a lot of the people, I don't know, I've asked people, but no one seems to know that a lot of the civilians in Idlib, I believe a lot of the men there are there because they know if they reconcile with the government, they will have to join the army. In fact,
how about that?
In fact, one of the main reasons a lot of the men didn't want to reconcile is because it meant they would join the army and go for really an endless period. I mean, because I know friends who served for 6 years and never really left service.
So there's also no limit to the amount of how many years you have to serve?
There hasn't been during the war. A very close relative of mine turned just over 18 and couldn't go to school for various reasons, but he joined the army then, and he wasn't let go till 6.5 years later when he injured his back so badly that he's actually permanently been disfigured, and that's how he left. But if you are healthy, yes, I mean a lot of people have served 6-7 years since the war started.
Well, I guess if there aren't that many jobs, that might, I don't know, some people might be okay with that, but I mean, that doesn't sound sustainable.
I mean, pay is hardly, commensurate with the price increases. It's a very, very tough going. And that's why a lot of the men have left, both for economic reasons, but as well as this particular reason. Well,
I mean, if it's true, I mean, here's one potential silver line. As you said, the number of casualties was at a record low for this war. If things do calm down, and if a lot of those guys in Idlib are people who were avoiding conscription, I'm assuming they're not going to get thrown in jail if they come back for assuming that they get amnesty.
No, this is part of the reconciliation process. I mean, you go through the questioning, you hand your guns, and if you're of age, you join the army. I mean, there hasn't really been many issues with it with people that have reconciled. Of course, I'm not privy to the details of every reconciliation deal that has taken place and how brilliantly it was carried out. But by and large, I think they've worked. I mean, we haven't heard any real, bad stories. There probably were some here and there that didn't go as well as planned. But in general, I think the reconciliation deals really cover a lot of these issues we have discussed.
Yeah, they do seem to go pretty smoothly. I don't hear.
Yes, indeed, yes.
All right. Well, we've been a little over an hour now. So is there anything else you want to talk about before we wrap up?
No, I think we covered every main issue. Let's wait for October 15th to come and take it from there.
Yeah. Maybe we can follow up in a couple of months or something to see how this is working out. I appreciate so much you coming on.
Thank you for reaching out.
Okay. Take care now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And that's our show. Thank you for listening. With a special thanks to Ehsani. Follow him on Twitter at EHSANI22, Ehsani22. And you can find some of his writing at the blog Syria Comment. The Around the Empire podcast is independent media brought to you with the help of our generous donors. You can pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or by doing one-time donation via our site aroundtheempire.com. Follow us on Twitter at Around the Empire. Helps a lot if you hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel. That's free. And we would be able to get revenue from that channel via live streams with Super Chat donations capability when we get to 1,000 subscribers. Also, use the thumbs up icon to like the individual videos. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Apple Podcast, or on your preferred radio and podcast apps. We're now on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Google Play. If you like the podcast, take a minute, leave a nice review. It helps a lot. And lastly, please like our page on Facebook. And we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.